She was 26 years old, standing in the mud outside a burned-out farmhouse with a deed in one hand and $11 in the other, and every person in Caldwell County had already decided she was going to fail. The land was called Harrow Flats, 42 acres of waterlogged bottomland in the low bend of Sutter Creek, the kind of ground that flooded every spring and stayed soggy until July. The farmhouse had burned 3 years back. Nobody knew exactly how, or nobody was saying, and what remained was a stone foundation, 2 walls of charred timber, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house that smelled like old water and rot. Her grandmother had owned it. Ida Holt, who had died in February without telling anyone she was planning to, had left the land to her granddaughter Nora in a will so simple the county clerk had read it twice to make sure he hadn't missed something. 4 sentences. Everything clear. The problem was that Nora Holt was in no position to inherit anything useful, and everyone knew Harrow Flats wasn't useful to begin with. Her husband had walked out the previous autumn, cleaned out what little they had in the savings account, and left a note on the kitchen table that said only, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't help." He had been right on both counts. Her job at the dry goods warehouse had dried up with the rest of the county's economy when the rail spur got rerouted north. She'd been living on what remained of her dignity and a neighbor woman's charity for 4 months when the letter about the will arrived. She drove out to look at the land with Tom Haskell, her grandmother's neighbor, who was 71 years old and had the permanent expression of a man who'd seen too many good ideas end badly. He stood at the edge of what used to be the front porch and looked at the foundation and the burned walls and the field beyond, which was green in the wrong way. The standing water kind of green, the kind that smelled like iron when the wind came down from the north. "Your grandmother was a stubborn woman," Tom said. He meant it as a fact, not a compliment. "I know, this ground floods every April, sometimes March if it's a wet winter. You get about 2 months of workable soil before the water table comes back up. What did she grow on it?" Tom looked at her. She didn't. She kept it because it was hers. Nora looked at the field. She looked at the foundation. She looked at the root cellar door set into the hillside, slightly ajar, hanging on hinges that needed replacing. "Is the deed clean?" "Far as I know. Your grandmother bought it outright in 1909. Nobody's touched it since." "What's it worth?" Tom took a long time answering. "To most people, very little. Land that floods regular doesn't sell well." He paused. "I know a man named Garrett Aldridge who's expressed interest." The name landed with a particular weight. Nora had grown up in Caldwell County. She knew who Garrett Aldridge was. What did he offer? $200. That was 3 years back, when the house was still standing. $200 for 42 acres was a price that told you everything you needed to know about what someone thought the land was worth, and also about what they thought the person selling it was worth. "It's not for sale," Nora said. Tom nodded slowly, like he'd expected that, and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or concerned. She moved onto the property the following week with what she could carry in the back of a borrowed truck: a canvas cot, 2 wool blankets, a cast-iron skillet, a box of tools she'd assembled piece by piece from the hardware store, a bag of flour, salt, dried beans, and a jar of her neighbor's preserved tomatoes that she'd been given as a going-away gift. The neighbor had hugged her and not said anything, which was the kindest thing anyone did that week. The root cellar was the only structure that had survived the fire intact. It was dug roughly 8 feet into the hillside, lined with stone, and covered with a timber-framed door that she replaced on the first day, using hinges she'd bought for $1.20 at the hardware store, and a piece of oak board she found in the collapsed barn at the back of the property. The space inside was 12 feet by 14. The floor was packed earth. The ceiling was low enough that Nora had to duck to walk without thinking about it. It was cold inside, even in late March. Steady cold. Not the biting outdoor cold, but the deep underground kind that stays constant regardless of what the weather does above. She held her hand flat against the stone wall and counted. The temperature didn't shift. She checked it again an hour later, and again at dusk. It didn't shift. That was the first thing she understood about the place, that nobody else had bothered to notice. She slept in the root cellar that first night on the canvas cot with both blankets pulled over her and listened to the rain come down outside the door. It rained for 3 days. The field flooded, the way Tom Haskell said it would. She walked the perimeter on the second day in rubber boots she'd found hanging on a nail in the collapsed barn, watching where the water moved, where it pooled, where it drained. The water drained south. That was something. It came in from the creek on the north edge of the property, moved through the low center of the field, and found its way out through a gap in the property line, where the ground dropped toward the county road. The flooding wasn't random. It had a pattern, a direction, a logic. It was doing exactly what water always does, which is finding the lowest path and following it. She stood in the rain and watched it for a long time. On the fourth day, when the rain stopped and the sky went flat and pale, Nora walked every inch of the property. She had a notebook she'd bought at the 5 and dime and a pencil, and she drew maps that were rough but accurate, marking where the ground was higher, where it was lower, where the soil changed from the gray clay of the flood plain to a darker, looser earth on the hillside above the cellar. She tested the soil in different places by pressing her thumb into it and noting how deep it went before hitting resistance. On the hillside, she could push her thumb in past the second knuckle before the ground pushed back. The hillside soil was different from the field soil, darker, looser, less clay. It hadn't been farmed, as far as she could tell, or not in many years. The slope faced southeast. She stood on it in the morning and let the light hit her face. It was good light, early and long, the kind of southeastern exposure that gave you warmth before most of the county had finished its coffee. She was not a farmer. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She'd kept a kitchen garden at her house in town, knew enough to put seeds in the ground and tend what came up, but she'd never worked 42 acres or anything close to it. What she had was her grandmother's letters, which she'd kept in a shoebox for years without reading carefully, and which she now read very carefully, sitting in the root cellar by lamplight with the notebook open beside her. Ida Holt had written about the land in the years before the house burned. Most of it was about water, the way it came in, the way it left, the way the hillside stayed dry even in the wettest springs. She'd written once about the hillside soil. That slope above the cellar has the best dirt on the property. I don't know why nobody ever put it to use. Seems like the kind of ground that wants to grow things. Nora read that sentence 3 times. She spent the next 2 weeks clearing the hillside. It was covered in blackberry cane and volunteer scrub, the kind of growth that happens when good ground is left alone for years, and she cut it back with a brush hook she sharpened every evening before bed. Her hands blistered and healed, and blistered again. She worked from first light until she couldn't see clearly, ate simple food that required almost no preparation, and slept hard. By the end of the second week, she had cleared roughly a third of the hillside. The soil underneath was everything the letters had promised and more. Dark, crumbling, rich with the accumulated decomposition of years of undisturbed growth. She tested it properly, the way her grandmother had taught her years ago, mixed a handful with water, and worked it between her fingers. It had structure and body. It held moisture without turning to paste. It was, by any measure she knew how to apply, genuinely good soil. The field below was still waterlogged. She was standing at the edge of the cleared hillside on a Sunday afternoon, looking down at the field and thinking about drainage, when she heard a truck coming down the road. It pulled in at the end of the drive, and a man got out who she recognized, before he was close enough to speak to. Garrett Aldridge was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of permanent tan that comes from spending every decade outdoors. He owned 800 acres of the better land north of town, and had opinions about most things that he expressed without much invitation. He walked toward her with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the cleared hillside, then at the field, then at the root cellar door. "Miss Holt," he said. He'd called her that since she was a child, even after she married. It was a habit that told you something about how he categorized people. "Mr. Aldridge, heard you'd moved out here." He looked around the property again. "Had to see it myself. Here I am. Your grandmother was a good woman," he said. "Stubborn, but good." He paused. "This land's been sitting fallow for 3 years. Before that, Ida never did much with it either. She kept it, she did." He looked at her. "I'd like to buy it. I'll give you $250, which is more than fair given the condition. You could get yourself set up somewhere with that money. Get back on your feet properly. $250. She thought about what that would buy. A room somewhere, a few months of stability while she found work. It was real money for someone with $11 and a canvas cot. "What would you do with it?" she asked. Aldridge looked at the field. "Drain it, or try to. I've got access to equipment that could cut a drainage channel along the north edge, might make the center of the field workable, and the hillside. He glanced up the slope, a quick look, not particularly interested. Grazing, probably. It's not wide enough for much else. Nora looked at the hillside she'd spent 2 weeks clearing, at the soil she'd been testing, at the southeastern exposure she'd been thinking about for days. It's not for sale, she said. Aldridge's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. He was a man who thought in terms of calculations, and she could see him recalculating. The flooding's going to make your spring planting impossible, he said. You know that. I'm not planting the field. He looked at her. Then what are you planting? The hillside. A pause. He looked at the slope, a longer look this time. You can't run crop rows up a hillside like that. The soil runs off every time it rains. There are ways to manage that. Miss Holt. His voice shifted slightly, went a degree more patient in the way that men's voices sometimes go when they're trying to be kind about someone else's poor judgment. I've been farming this county for 30 years. That slope faces the wrong direction for most crops. The angle is too steep for mechanized equipment, and you'd be fighting erosion every season. It's not practical. My offer stands, he said. Think about it. He walked back to his truck without waiting for a response and drove away. Nora stood at the edge of the cleared hillside until the truck was out of sight. Then she went back to work. The terracing idea had come to her on the third day of clearing, when she'd watched the rain run down the hillside and carry a thin layer of the dark soil with it. The problem wasn't the slope itself, it was that the slope was unbroken. Water moving down an unbroken incline picked up speed and carried things with it. But if you interrupted the slope, cut horizontal shelves into it, the water would slow and spread and sink rather than run. The soil would stay where you put it. She had never built a terrace. She'd read about them in a book she'd found on her grandmother's shelf, a farming manual from 1917 that covered hillside cultivation in a chapter she'd gone back to 3 times. The principle was simple. The execution, she was learning, was not. She cut the first terrace level by eye, and it wasn't level. She figured that out when she watered it from a can and watched the water pool to one side and run off the edge. She cut it again, this time using a line level she'd borrowed from Tom Haskell, stretching cord between stakes and adjusting until every inch was even. The second attempt held water. She stood back and looked at it for a long moment. Then she cut the second one. By mid-April, she had 4 terraces cut into the hillside. Each one was 4 feet wide, reinforced along the downhill edge, with flat stones she'd carried up from the creek bed, and she'd laid a narrow channel along the back of each shelf to direct any overflow to the ends, rather than over the front edge. The stone reinforcement had taken a full week, because the stones were heavy and the hillside was steep, and by the end of it she'd developed a rope and fulcrum system for moving them that she was unreasonably proud of. She planted the top 2 terraces first, potatoes, because they were forgiving, and she trusted them, and a row of pole beans along the upper edge of each shelf where they could climb without shading the plants below. She put in onion sets she'd gotten from Tom Haskell in trade for helping him mend a fence, a half-day's work that she'd done in a Saturday, and a section of garlic she'd brought from her old kitchen garden, carried in a burlap sack and kept viable. She watered by hand from the creek, carrying buckets up the slope twice a day, morning and evening. It was hard work. It was the kind of work that shows you exactly what your body is capable of, and then asks it to do a little more. She lost weight she didn't have, and gained muscle she needed, and after 3 weeks she'd stopped thinking about it as hard, and started thinking about it as the work. The lower 2 terraces she kept for later, when she had more seed and a clearer sense of what the hillside wanted to produce. In the meantime, she turned her attention to the root cellar. The steady temperature she'd noticed that first night was not an accident. It was a function of the depth and the stone lining and the hillside above acting as insulation. The cellar stayed at roughly 52 degrees, regardless of outside weather, which she confirmed by hanging a thermometer on the wall and checking it for 2 weeks at different times of day. 52 degrees was cold enough to slow decomposition, but warm enough to sustain plant life. She extended the root cellar. That was the project she hadn't told anyone about, because she was still working out whether it was possible, and the answer turned out to be yes. The back wall of the cellar was earth and stone, and behind it, the hillside rose another 30 feet before the ground leveled off. She borrowed a mattock from Tom Haskell and started digging. It took her most of 3 weeks. She worked in the cellar every evening after the terrace work was done for the day, by lantern light, moving earth in buckets she dragged to the door and emptied outside. The stones she encountered she stacked as she went, building the new passage walls as she cleared them. It was slow, physical, methodical work, the kind of work that gives you time to think. What she was building, she understood gradually, was a growing space that the weather couldn't touch. The extended passage was 8 feet wide and ran 22 feet into the hillside before the stone became too dense to move without equipment. The temperature was even steadier deeper in, 50 degrees, unchanging. She framed the ceiling with timber salvaged from the collapsed barn, working carefully, testing every beam before she trusted it. The floor she leveled and packed hard. She built growing beds along the walls, narrow ones, 2 feet wide, framed in wood, filled with soil she carried in from the hillside. Not just any soil, the darkest, most composted earth from the top of the terraces, mixed with the material she'd been collecting from the creek bank, where years of organic deposit had built up a layer of black river silt. She tested the mixture the same way she tested everything, pressed it between her fingers, worked it with water, watched how it behaved. The question of light was the honest problem, and she was honest about it. The cellar and the passage got no direct sunlight. She had lanterns, and she put them on rotation, keeping 2 burning at all times in the passage during what she thought of as the day hours, moving them to different sections to give each bed a period of light. She did not tell herself this was the same as sunlight. She told herself it was enough light for certain things. And then she planted those things. Sprouts first, mung bean and wheatberry, which she'd read could germinate in low light conditions, and which she'd tested in a jar on the cellar shelf before committing to a full bed. They came up. She moved to radishes, which wanted less light than most vegetables, and which came in faster than she expected. Then lettuce, the loose-leaf kind, which her grandmother had always grown in partial shade, and which seemed not to mind the lantern situation at all. She found watercress in the creek in late April, and transplanted it to a bed she'd positioned closest to the cellar door, where it got the most indirect light. It naturalized within 2 weeks and started spreading. She let it. The potatoes on the upper terraces came up in early May. She stood on the hillside and looked at the rows of green emerging from the dark soil, and allowed herself 1 quiet minute of something that wasn't quite pride, but was close to it. Then she went back to work. She was moving stones at the base of the second terrace on a Tuesday morning, when a woman came down the road on foot, which was unusual enough that Nora stopped what she was doing and watched. The woman was 60 or so, heavy-set, with a deliberate way of walking that suggested she'd been covering ground on foot for most of her life. She came to the end of the drive and stopped. "You're the Holt girl," the woman said. "Ida's granddaughter." "That's right. I'm Ruth Crane. I live about 2 miles east on the Sutter Road. I knew your grandmother 20-some years." She looked at the hillside, at the terraces, at the stone reinforcement along the edges. "Drove past here twice this week and couldn't figure out what you were doing. Had to stop and ask." Nora showed her. She walked Ruth Crane up the hillside and explained the terracing and the drainage and the southeastern exposure. Ruth listened without interrupting, which Nora appreciated. At the top of the cleared slope, Ruth stood with her hands on her hips, looking down at the layout. "I've never seen hillside terracing done like this in this county," Ruth said. "I found it in an old farming manual. Did it work?" "So far." Ruth looked at her steadily. "What's the problem with it then? There's always something. Water for the upper terraces," Nora said. "I'm carrying it by hand from the creek. That's sustainable now, but not through the summer." Ruth nodded. She looked at the hillside, then at the creek, then back up at the slope. "My husband put in a gravity feed system on our property 30 years back. Runs water from the spring above our barn down to the lower pasture. I could have him draw it out for you, the basic principle. I'd appreciate that." Ruth studied her for another moment. "Aldridge was at the grain store on Saturday, saying you'd refused his offer. Said you were planning to farm the hillside and that you'd be gone by August. He's wrong on the last part. He usually is about people." Ruth picked up her hat from where she'd set it on a fence post and put it back on. "My husband's name is Owen. I'll send him by this week." She walked back down the driveway the same deliberate way she'd come, and Nora went back to moving stones. Owen Crane came on Thursday. He was a quiet man, slight, who communicated primarily through diagrams. He sat at the folding table Nora had set up outside the cellar door, drew a cross-section of the hillside on a piece of brown paper, and showed her how a buried ceramic pipe running from a holding tank at the top of the slope could deliver water by gravity to any point downhill. The math was simple. The holding tank was the project. She built the holding tank herself over the following 3 weeks, using stone from the creek bed and mortar she mixed by hand. It was located at the highest point of the cleared hillside, set into a natural depression that already collected runoff. She tiled the floor with flat creek stones sealed with clay, built the walls 2 feet high, and fitted a wooden cover to keep debris out. The pipe she couldn't afford new, but Tom Haskell had a stack of old ceramic drainage tile in his barn that he sold her for 50 cents per 10-foot section. She bought 8 sections. Laying the pipe required digging a trench along the entire length of the hillside from tank to lowest terrace, graded precisely downhill. She did it in sections over a week, digging before dawn when it was cool, laying pipe in the afternoon, backfilling in the evening. When she opened the valve at the tank for the first time and watched water move down the line and emerge at the first terrace outlet, she made a sound that she later couldn't accurately describe. Not a word, just a sound. The water system changed the summer. With reliable irrigation, the terraces grew faster and healthier than she'd planned for. By June, she had more lettuce than she could eat and began selling the surplus to Ruth Crane, who sold it at the weekly market in town. By July, the potatoes were coming in heavy, the beans were productive, and the watercress in the cellar passage had spread to fill 3 full beds and required harvesting twice a week. The cellar passage had become something she hadn't entirely anticipated. The consistent temperature and moisture, combined with the growing beds and the rotation of lantern light, had produced an environment that a certain kind of plant found nearly ideal. The watercress was thriving beyond what she'd expected. The lettuce grew faster underground than on the terraces. She'd added a bed of green onions that had naturalized along the wall, like they'd always meant to be there. She didn't advertise what was in the cellar passage, not because it was a secret, but because she hadn't figured out yet how to explain it in a way that made sense to people who hadn't seen it. Aldridge came back in July. He came alone this time, without the calculation behind the eyes expression, and pulled up at the end of the drive while she was carrying a harvest basket down from the upper terraces. He looked at the basket. He looked at the hillside. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Terracing," he said finally. "That's right. Those look like potato plants on the upper level. They are." He was quiet again. She could see him working through it, the mechanics of what she'd done, why it worked, what it meant. He was not a stupid man. That had never been the issue with Garrett Aldridge. "The flooding this spring didn't touch your hill," he said. "No. The water runs north to south through the field and drains out at the county road. It never reaches the slope." He looked at the harvest basket. "You've got a water source up there? Gravity feed from a holding tank at the top. Runoff collection." Another pause. He looked at her differently than he had in March. Not with the patient expression he used for explaining problems to people who didn't understand them, but with the straightforward look of a man reassessing something he'd gotten wrong. "I've got 80 acres on my north property," he said. "That has a similar slope situation. West-facing, not south, which limits options, but the drainage is good. I've never figured out what to do with it." Nora set down the harvest basket. "What's the soil like?" "Sandy on the surface. Gets heavier about 18 inches down. What grows on it naturally?" He thought about it. "Bunch grass. Some wild buckwheat. A few scrub oak." She thought about that. Buckwheat and bunch grass on sandy soil usually means good drainage and decent organic content. West-facing limits you to afternoon crops, things that want warmth later in the day rather than morning. Squash might do well. Melons, if you have the season for it. Aldridge looked at her. "How do you know that?" "My grandmother wrote about this property for 30 years. I read carefully." He picked up his hat and turned in his hands. "I might want to talk to you about that north property sometime, properly." He paused. "If you'd be open to it, I'd want something for my time," she said. "That's fair." He put his hat back on. "I'll be in touch." He got in his truck and drove away, and Nora picked up the harvest basket and kept walking. She told Ruth Crane about it that Thursday when Ruth came to collect the week's lettuce order. Ruth listened and nodded and said, "He asked you for advice. He suggested he might. That's Aldridge asking for advice." Ruth tucked the lettuce into her basket. "He doesn't do that." I've known him 20 years. Nora thought about what that meant and decided it meant she'd built something credible enough that the county's most skeptical man had noticed. The summer moved through its warmest weeks, and the cellar passage became the place she spent most of her mornings, checking the beds, harvesting, replanting in rotation so there was always something coming. She'd learned which plants did best at which distance from the door, where the lantern light reached most consistently, where the moisture was highest along the east wall, where a thin seep of groundwater dampened the stone. That seep had been something she'd noticed in March and had taken her time understanding. It emerged from between two stones in the east wall of the extended passage, a slow, steady flow, not a drip, more a persistent weeping of cold, clear water that ran down the wall and pooled in the corner before draining away through a gap in the floor she'd fitted with a clay outlet pipe. She'd tasted it in April. Clean, no mineral aftertaste, no sulfur. She'd tested it again in June when the summer heat was at its worst above ground. It was the same temperature as the cellar itself, 50 degrees, constant. She built a small stone basin to collect it, sealed the floor around the basin with clay, and now had a permanent water source inside the passage that required no carrying. She watered the nearest beds directly from the basin and used the overflow to feed the planted section at the east end, where she'd put in a bed of horseradish, whose roots were already showing the kind of aggressive growth that suggested it intended to stay. In August, a woman she didn't recognize came out to the property. She was about 40 thin, with the careful clothing of someone from town rather than country. She stood at the end of the drive looking at the hillside for a long moment before walking up. "I'm Margaret Shoup," she said. "I write for the Caldwell Courier. I know the paper. I've been hearing things about what you're doing out here. From Ruth Crane and from Owen and from a few people at the market who've been buying your lettuce." She looked at the terraces, which were dense and green and producing visibly even from a distance. "I'd like to write about it." Nora thought about that for a moment. What kind of piece? A feature. About the property, what you've done with it, how it works. Margaret paused. "Honestly, the angle that interests me is the flooding problem. Half the bottomland farmers in this county lose weeks every spring to standing water. What you've figured out about working the hillside, I think other people would want to know. What you've built up here solves a problem a lot of people in this county have," Margaret said. "That's a story." Nora looked at the terraces. She thought about the cellar passage and the watercress beds and the gravity feed system and the seep basin and all the things she'd worked out alone over the past 5 months, mostly through failure and correction. "Come back on Saturday," she said. "I'll show you all of it." Margaret came on Saturday with a notepad and a camera. Nora walked her through everything. The terracing method, the stone reinforcement, the gravity feed system, the holding tank, the rotation planting on each shelf. Then she took her inside the cellar and down the passage with a lantern. Margaret Shoup stood in the underground passage and looked at the beds of watercress and lettuce and green onions growing steadily in the lantern light and was quiet for a longer time than people usually stayed quiet. "This is producing now," she said finally. "In August, every week, through winter. That's the plan. The temperature doesn't change. The light and water are consistent. There's no reason it should stop." Margaret wrote in her notepad for a while. She asked specific questions, how Nora had figured out the soil mixture, where the lantern rotation idea had come from, how long the watercress had taken to establish. Nora answered all of it directly and without embellishment, because the facts were interesting enough on their own. On the way out, passing through the main cellar, Margaret stopped at the thermometer on the wall. 52 degrees, she read. Constant. I've been tracking it since March. Even this week, when it was 91 above ground. Even this week. Margaret wrote that down. Then she said, Garrett Aldridge told me at the grain store last week that you'd be gone by August. He told me the same thing in March. Margaret looked at her. He also told me, and he didn't know I was coming here, that you were the only person he'd ever met who understood his north property better than he did after one conversation. Nora thought about that. She thought about the expression on Aldridge's face in July, the reassessment. He's a man who knows land, she said. He just expected it to know things back at him the same way it always had. Sometimes a piece of ground has to be read differently. The piece ran in the Courier the following Thursday, 2 columns with a photograph of the terraced hillside and a smaller one of the cellar passage. Nora read it at Tom Haskell's kitchen table over coffee, and Tom read it beside her without saying anything until he got to the end. "She got it right," he said. "She did. You're going to have people coming out here." "I know. Is that all right?" Nora thought about it. She thought about the months alone on the property, the evenings in the cellar passage with a lantern, the mornings on the hillside before the heat built up. She thought about what she'd built and what she still needed to build, and how much of the latter she'd been doing alone, because there was no one else. "Yes," she said. "It's all right." She was right. People came. Not many, not all at once, but steadily through August and into September. Farmers mostly, or people with farming questions. A man from the east side of the county who had a hillside situation similar to hers and wanted to understand the terracing. A woman who kept a large kitchen garden and had flooding problems every spring that were destroying her root vegetables. Two brothers from north of town who were trying to figure out what to do with a low-lying piece of land they'd inherited and couldn't sell. Nora talked to all of them. She showed them what she'd built and explained how she'd built it, and she was honest about what had failed before she'd gotten it right. She charged for her time, not much, but something, because her grandmother had told her once that people don't value what they don't pay for, and Nora had found this to be accurate. Aldridge came back in September, this time with a hand-drawn map of his north property and specific questions. They sat at the folding table outside the cellar door for 2 hours, and Nora asked him about the soil and the drainage, and the existing vegetation, and the sun angle at different times of day. At the end of it, she gave him a written recommendation, 2 pages in her notebook torn out and handed over, and told him what she thought was worth trying and what she thought would fail and why. He read it twice at the table and then folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "What do I owe you?" she told him. He paid it without negotiating, which was the first time in her memory that Garrett Aldridge had paid a price without at least testing it. "That north property," he said, standing up. "If the buckwheat and melon idea works, I'll want to talk to you again." "I'll be here." He nodded and left. She watched him drive away and thought about the distance between March and September, between a man offering to buy her out for $250 and a man paying for her advice. It was a considerable distance. She thought about something her grandmother had written in a letter from maybe 1930, a letter Nora had read a dozen times since March. "The land I have is not much to look at. But I've found that most people look at the wrong things first. They see what's difficult and miss what's already there." The field below the hillside had flooded again in September after a heavy week of rain. Nora stood at the edge of it one morning, looking at the standing water, and she thought about what was already there. The north to south drainage path, the clay subsoil that held water like a vessel, the fact that standing water, if you worked with it rather than against it, could be managed rather than fought. She had an idea that was going to take the winter to think through properly. Something about water management, about working the drainage path deliberately, about what you could do with a wet bottomland if you stopped trying to make it into something else and started asking what it already was. That was for later. There was enough to do now. October came in cold, and the terraces went into their end-of-season wind down, but the cellar passage didn't change. 52 degrees, the lanterns on rotation, the watercress beds producing the same as they had in June. She harvested and replanted in the same rhythm, and the underground garden kept on going the way it had always been going, steadily, quietly, without any particular acknowledgement of what the calendar said. Tom Haskell came out in the first week of October to help her winterize the holding tank. He was the only person who'd seen the property from the very beginning, and he walked around it now with a different expression than the one he'd had in March. He didn't say much about it until they were finishing up at the tank, and the afternoon light was coming across the hillside at the low October angle that makes everything look like it's been there a long time. "Your grandmother would have liked this," he said. "I think she always knew the hillside was worth something. She just didn't get to it. Maybe she was saving it." Tom shrugged, the shrug of a man who didn't fully believe what he was saying but found the idea decent enough to offer. Some things wait for the right person. Nora looked at the terraces, at the harvested beds mulched with straw for winter, at the pipe network running down the slope, at the stone walls along each shelf that she'd set one by one over the course of a summer, at the cellar door behind which green things were growing in the steady lantern light, and would go on growing, She thought about what she'd had in March. $11, a canvas cot, a deed everyone said was worthless, and her grandmother's handwriting in a shoebox. She thought about what she had now, which was not, by most county standards, a great deal. A working hillside garden, an underground growing space, a water system, a reputation she hadn't sought but had earned. A place where she understood how everything worked, because she had built everything herself. Mostly wrong before she built it right. It was hers, not the way a house in town is yours when you pay rent and someone else owns the walls. Hers, in the specific way that comes from having put yourself into a piece of ground for long enough that you can't separate what you built from why you built it. She told Tom she'd see him Thursday, the way she always did, and watched him drive down the county road until the truck disappeared around the bend. Then she picked up the shovel she'd left leaning against the tank and went back to work. There was always more work that had stopped being a burden sometime around May and had become, instead, just the shape of the day. The thing that organized everything else around it. She didn't need it to be anything other than what it was. The land was not what anyone had said it was. It never had been. It had just been waiting for someone to read it right.